I have one goal in this video, to shock you with Hans Niemann's best game ever versus Magnus Carlsen. In the game, Magnus opens 1e4, and Hans Niemann responds with 1c5, the Sicilian defense, and he goes after knight f3, knight to c6, heading for a Sveshnikov variation if Magnus goes d4. And instead of that, Magnus denies the Sveshnikov. He goes for perhaps the strongest and most popular move here, bishop b5, the Rosolino Sicilian. And of course, Magnus has two main ideas here as why. One is simply taking the knight on c6, doubling black's pawn structure after b takes or d takes. And the other option is simply a fast short castles, rook to e1, and then trying to play in the center with c3 and d4. So overall, very flexible move by Magnus. And now here, Hans Niemann has a choice. There are a lot of popular moves. e6, d6, and knight f6 are all playable here. But instead, Hans going for the old move, g6. He wants to fianchetto the bishop on g7, applying pressure on the long diagonal. Now from here, castles, bishop g7, rook e1, very standard stuff. And here Hans Niemann strikes in the center with the move knight to f6, trying to attack that pawn on e4. And of course, once again, Magnus has a wide range of options. c3 intending d4 is good, bishop takes c6 is good, but instead, Magnus, he sharpens the position and he strikes in the center with the move e5. Now, of course, the knight is being attacked. It has to move somewhere, and d5 is the best square for the knight. That is what Hans plays in the game. And here, Magnus Carlsen plays a move that is a little bit surprising if you haven't studied this position. Here, he jumps forward with the knight to the c3 square, knight to c3. Now, this move is surprising because in a lot of these Sicilian positions with knights on d5, c4 is going to be the move. However, in this position, after c4, knight to c7, you don't want to have that bishop on b5 here. It's a little bit misplaced, and black is actually doing pretty well. So instead, knight to c3, the best move by far, and the one Magnus chose in the game. Now, it's important to note here, black has the option of doubling white's pawns on the c-file with knight takes c3. However, here, that is not a good idea at all. For example, after knight takes c3, you don't recapture with the b pawn. I mean, that looks logical enough, recapturing towards the center. However, the better move is actually d takes c3, and it turns out white has dynamic piece play that more than offsets for the weakened pawn structure on the queen side. For example, he can follow up bishop f4, queen d2, bishop h6, trying to trade off black's very important dark squared bishop on the g7 square. So instead of all this, here in this position, knight c7 was the move from black, protecting the knight by retreating it and also hitting the bishop. Now from here, Magnus, he takes on c6. Hans Niemann takes back with the d-pawn, and this is pretty much where the opening phase of the game is over. White has maybe a small advantage, pretty typical for the Rosolino Sicilian, but it's not too much. And of course, the big feature of the position is this imbalance of black's weakened pawn structures on the queen side. However, he does have the bishop pair to compensate for that. So pretty much the entire game is going to revolve around white trying to attack those pawns on the queen side and black trying to capitalize on the strength of the bishop pair. And here Magnus finds a very strong idea immediately, knight to e4. The idea, of course, is obviously you're attacking the pawn on c5. However, beyond that, this knight jump has a hidden idea, and that is the idea of knight to f6 check. Now, you may be asking yourself, why the heck would white threaten knight to f6 in this position? Well, let's find out. In the game, Hans Niemann goes b6, simply defending the c5 pawn. And here Magnus shows his idea, knight to f6, and let's say Hans Niemann was careless enough to capture the knight on f6 with the e-pawn. E takes f6, then e takes f6, and suddenly the rook is hitting the king with check, and the bishop on g7 is attacked. So for example, here, king f8, f takes g7, king takes g7, and here in this position, white has a crushing advantage. The black dark squared bishop is gone, and that means his dark squares around the king are going to be incredibly weak for the rest of the game. So going back to this position on move 10 after the knight jump, of course, bishop takes f6 is also possible. However, that gives up the dark squared bishop for very little compensation. Bishop takes, e takes, and here black is again going to be in a world of trouble. So instead of all that, after knight s6, king f8 on the board. Now this is a defensive move, getting the king out of the check. However, black is actually threatening e takes f6 now, as after e takes f6 back, there would not be an attack on the king. So from here, Magnus, he plays the strongest move, simply knight to e4, retreating the knight. Let's just have a quick replay at this crazy idea Magnus played in the game. Knight to f6, forcing king to f8, and then he says, all right, my job is done. We're we're jumping back to the e4 square with the knight. So brilliant stuff by Magnus, but of course Hans Niemann, this was his best game ever versus Magnus. Let's see how he fights back from this position. From here, Hans Niemann starts bishop to g4, good move, pinning the knight to the queen here, and also freeing up the e6 square for the knight. Now, of course, the knight could have gone to e6 before, but now knight e6 is possible where the bishop is outside the knight instead of being trapped on the c8 square. So excellent idea, and sure enough, d3 from Magnus, good move in this kind of pawn structure with these double pawns on the c-file, and now knight to e6. And here, that knight is actually tremendously placed on the e6 square. It has very good access to d4 and f4, the two best squares for the knight. So surprisingly, despite having the king on the f8 square where it cannot castle, Hans Niemann in this game so far is doing pretty okay. Now from here, Magnus, knight e to g5. He decides it is time to trade off that powerful knight on the e6 square, and that is what happens. Knight takes g5, bishop takes g5, and now Hans with the very powerful centralizing move, queen to d5. The queen very active on the d5 square, and of course the immediate threat is simply bishop takes, queen takes, g takes, and suddenly white would have that double pawns on the f-file. So for example, h3, bishop takes, queen takes, g takes, and suddenly here Hans Niemann would have a pretty decent endgame. So instead of all that, in this position here, Magnus Carlsen jumps forward with the rook to e4, very good multi-purpose move. First of all, blocking the queen's attack on the knight on f3. However, beyond that, the rook also pressures that bishop on the g4 square. So of course, Hans Niemann has to respect the threat. He retreats the bishop to f5. Now the rook is being attacked, and here Magnus, I think he throws a little bit too much flair into this move. He goes c4, ignoring the threat on the rook, instead counterattacking against Hans Niemann's queen. However, I'm gonna be honest, I'm not the biggest fan of this move. Here Hans just retreats queen to e6, and now it's starting to look like Magnus Carlsen's pawn structure is a little bit vulnerable here. I mean, imagine that pawn was back on the c2 square, then d3 would be much better defended. So this could be a problem for Magnus. Now rook e3, retreating the rook, and also over-defending d3, good idea. And now Hans Niemann busts out a really interesting attacking idea. You do see this one a lot in the Rosalimo from Black's perspective, and the idea is you expand on the king side, starting with h6, then bishop f4, and then g5. So wow, what's the idea here? Well, obviously, bishop's got to go back to the g3 square, and here Hans Niemann has the future threat of h5 to h4, and suddenly this rook on the h8 square, instead of being passive, it's actually entering the game somehow. So overall, Hans Niemann making the best of his king stuck on the f8 square. It looks like all of his pieces are starting to coordinate perfectly. Okay, Hans, rook d8 from here, getting the last piece into the game on the d8 square. Now Magnus, h3, creates some loft for the bishop, back to h2 at some point. And here Hans goes for a really weird looking idea. King to g8, and then king to h7. So Hans, I guess, technically artificially castling. I'm not sure what you call it. Either way, the rooks are connected here. Man, what a wild game so far. And now Magnus showing the idea of a3 just a move prior. He tries to blow up on the queen side with the move b4, but I think this move is just creating more weaknesses for him. I'm not so sure about it. Here Hans, he stays cool, calm, and collected, going rook to d7, and now Magnus busts open the b file. B takes c5, b takes c5, and queen b3. I guess maybe he wants to infiltrate on the b file, but I mean, where is the queen gonna go? The rooks and the pawns seem to have all these squares covered. Now Hans, rook h to d8, increasing the pressure on d3. I mean, Hans has 3 pieces attacking versus 2 defending. Magnus has to respond. He does that with rook to d1. But now Hans, queen g6, again, just increasing the pressure. The queen now attacking d3 as well. So far, Magnus is still very much in the game. However, Hans is just increasing the pressure slowly but surely. And now Magnus makes another mistake. He retreats the knight to e1. Yes, this knight is defending the d3 square. However, I'm not so sure about this idea. Instead, the computer likes a bunch of other moves better. Perhaps queen to a4, targeting a7 and c6, and perhaps even the pawn sacrifice e6, trying to activate the pieces. So for example, e6, bishop takes knight to e5. This actually looks better than what was played in the game. Now the knight defends the d3 pawn. The knight's very active, pressuring c6. So overall, e6 would have probably been a better move for Magnus here. Instead, knight to e1 on the board, and here Hans Niemann, he just goes full beast mode in this game. He launches the h-pawn down the board, first to h5, then to h4, kicking the bishop back to the h2 square, and believe it or not, This bishop h2 may have been a mistake. Instead, e6 was actually the strongest move here. Once again, trying to sacrifice the pawn. And if Hans Niemann takes it with the bishop, you jump forward, bishop to e5, and Magnus is still fighting. However, instead, bishop h2 played in the game, logical but not good enough. And now Hans Niemann blocks that e6 threat forever. e6, and here Hans Niemann solidifies his advantage with an absolutely dominating position. And now from here, both sides start to shuffle a little bit. Magnus Carlsen, queen c3, Hans, bishop f8, trying to defend the c5 square in advance, knight to e1 for Magnus. And here Hans Niemann decides it is time to go for it. He strikes with the move g4, blowing open white's kingside. And from here, the game gets unbelievably sharp. You do not want to miss the ending for this game. All right, Magnus f3 trying to block out the bishop, bishop f5 retreating, and now f4. I guess the idea is he wants to free up the f3 square for the knight, but Hans Niemann, bishop to h6, pressuring f4. And beyond that, of course, freeing up the way for the rooks to enter the game on the g-file. Now Magnus, queen to a5, trying to get some counterplay going on the queen side. However, now the queen is super far away from the king side. That is where the action is happening. Instead of that, queen to d2 was perhaps the better idea, with the idea of going queen f2 in the near future, trying to defend. Instead, queen a5, removing one of the critical defenders of the king side. Magnus Carlsen not playing his best chess in this game. Now Hans, queen to g4, bringing the queen over into the attack, and of course also threatening that vulnerable rook on the d1 square. Those rooks no longer defended, Hans Niemann jumping on it. Now, once again, queen to d2 is the best move for Magnus Carlsen, trying to get the queen back into the game and defending, but instead, rook to f3, trying to block the attack on the rook, but this is a critical mistake. Here, Hans pounces, bishop to e4, attacking the rook, and the pawn is pinned, because if you take the bishop, rook takes d1, and that would be effectively game over. So instead of all that, here Magnus demonstrates his idea. He wants to win this c5 pawn, even if it means costing him the exchange, and Hans obliges, bishop takes, knight takes, and here the next big move, h3, Prince Harry, the h-pawn, His Royal Highness. I bet you didn't expect the h-pawn to decide this game, but here we are. All right, Magnus, queen to f2, finally getting the queen back into the game, but it is too little, too late. Hans jumps in, takes the pawn on the d3 square. His rook is now active, and oh my, just look at Magnus Carlsen's position with these pieces here all bundled up. This is not good. All right, Magnus, knight e1, hitting the rook, trying to defend, but here Hans Niemann, rook takes a3. I mean, not a hard move to find. Here Hans Niemann is already up. The exchange, he has the rook for the knight, is an extra pawn. I mean, this is just too much, even for Magnus Carlsen to come back from. Rook e3, king f2, bishop takes f4. Hans Niemann wins yet another pawn. He's now up 2 pawns and the exchange, the rook for the knight, and in this position, Magnus Carlsen resigned on the spot to Hans Niemann. Wow, what a game, and in my opinion, this is definitely Hans Niemann's best game ever versus Magnus Carlsen. So what do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let me know in the comments section below, and I'll see you in the next video.